Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Is that what I'm supposed to say? It's a Monday. It has been chaotic this morning, to say the least. At some point in the near future, I'm saying maybe in the next 3 to 6 months, I envision potentially having a chance to get in the field as a photographer and make a film about doing a project in the field. So I have mixed emotions about this. And has nothing to do with the film I'm talking about today. I just thought of this, and because I have no plan and no coherent nature to this channel, and I do everything in one take, I'm just gonna roll with it. So I would love to make YouTube films about doing projects because based on my experience so far on YouTube, I think there's a real need for it. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about photography projects, how to compose one, all the different components that go into it. So I would love to do that. The problem is, and the reality is, that I can't do two things at once. So for me to go in the field and do a project is one thing. To go in the field and do a project and try to film it and shoot it at the same time is probably impossible. And it's probably why you don't see that a whole lot. You see films about photographers that are done by crews. Those are cool. I like those. But it's very rare that someone can go in the field, film themselves, and then actually turn in a really good photo project, because I don't know how you do that. But maybe I can show like little snippets. I do have an ongoing project that is one of the best things I've ever done in terms of it's one of the most entertaining things I've ever done. It's very interesting and it's very unlike anything I've done. But it's about 1,000 miles from here. So until COVID shakes itself out and we get a little better idea of what's going to be doable, I won't know. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I don't know, I lose track of time. All I do is emails and phone calls for the most part these days. A couple of weeks ago, I did a YouTube Live with Mark Silber from Advancing Your Photography, and it was about 10 words that I think are good words to represent photographers. There are things that I look for in photographers, and there are things that represent my heroes in photography. And then with each one of those words, I gave a photographer as an example of someone who I think exemplifies that word. I did the YouTube Live, and about halfway through it, I was like to myself, this is really good. I like this. If someone else did this, I would probably watch it. If someone else I knew, like a photographer that I really respected, did it, I would probably stop what I was doing and listen, because I'd be curious who their influence was. So I decided to do a version of this on my own on this channel so that it would be out there for a long time, hypothetically, and maybe someone will like it, because I do think these people are worth knowing. So I have 11 words that I think represent words that should be represented by photographers, and then someone who exemplifies that word. Number one, compassion. And don't worry, I'll link these photographers down below. Well, at least I think I'll link them. I might get too busy and too lazy. But the first word is compassion. And let me just back up a second. The reason this came about was like in between emails and phone calls last week or 2 weeks ago, I was thinking about our political scenario in America, and I thought, what are some of the words that I think should represent our politicians, regardless of party? And that's where these words came from. And then my twisted mind said, who cares about the politicians? Let's think about photography. So the first word is compassion, and the photographer that I think represents it really well is a guy named Martine Chombi. And Martine Chombi is long since gone. He passed away many, many years ago. But he was a photographer, a Peruvian photographer that spent a lot of time photographing the indigenous community way back in the day, in the 1800s, early 1900s. And Chombi has an archive that is remarkable. And Chombi spent, just to think of logistically what he had to go through to do photography at that time, at that skill level, at that capacity, and also the amount of imagery he made. I've actually been to Cusco, Peru several times, but I was able to get in thanks to Adam Weintraub, photoexperienceworkshops.net, I believe, or .com. Adam knows the people who are in charge of the Chombi archive, so we were able to actually get in and handle some of the 8x10 glass plates that he shot. He shot tens of thousands of 8x10 glass plates and thousands of 4x5 glass plates. They are remarkable. They are beautiful portraiture. Also, Chombi lived in Cusco, and he had built a series of weird pieces of fabric that would reflect light into the interior of his building so that he could shoot available light portraits inside. It was ingenious for the day. It would still be cool today, but back in the day, it was truly an ingenious contraption. And Adam pointed out to me where Chombi used to live. And so I knocked on the door one day, and it turns out that a family was living in this building. And I, in my horrible Spanish, convinced them that I was just a big fan of Chombi and that I would love to see where he lived. And so they let me in the house. And there were people like sleeping on the couches, and I went through bedrooms, and I got to get in and sort of see where Chombi did his work. But if you don't know him, that archive and just whatever you can find online is pretty remarkable. And to think about the way that the indigenous community was viewed and the amount of time that he spent, to me, was above and beyond when it comes to the idea of compassion. And I think as a photographer, you cannot draw lines in the sand and say, like, if I was going to do a story on the border, and let's say that I was anti-immigration, or I was professional, or I was pro-immigration, you can't draw a line in the sand and say, I'm going to go make pictures that like support my point of view. You have to be compassionate to all sides of that story. You have to be the impartial observer to the best of your ability. And Chombi represents compassion to me in a great way. Point number two, word number two, is patience. And the photographer I'm using to represent patience is Howard Bingham, who was Muhammad Ali's photographer. And Howard Bingham is also passed away. And Howard was one of the nicest people I have ever met in photography, period, anywhere. I think I met him walking down the street in Perpignan, France at the Visa pour l'Image Festival way back in the day, late 90s. And Howard was a big dude. He had a very heavy stutter, but he always had a smile on his face, regardless of what he was doing or what he was talking about. So I met him in France. I come back. I was working for Kodak at the time. I come back to the US. Howard says, oh, you live in Los Angeles. You should come to Watts and I'll drive you around and show you some of the places that I used to go with Ali. So I did. And I drove down to Watts. Howard drove me all over the place. We spent the day together. He said, what are you working on? I said, oh, I'm doing this project on the intersection of 5th and Broadway in downtown Los Angeles, which is at the time was sort of a microcosm of the entire city. It represented every demographic of person that lived in the city of Los Angeles at some point in time could be found at that intersection. So I tell this to Howard and he stops the car and he starts laughing and he goes, that's the intersection that I met Ali. He said, I had a car, I was driving along, I looked out on the curb and Ali was standing there and I said, hey, do you want to go meet some girls? And that's how they met. So Howard was Ali's photographer, and if you think about that, you have the most recognizable athlete in the world. You have someone who transcends sport, transcends politics. Ali was a unique creature in the history of the world. And Howard is there every day making pictures and shooting and shooting and shooting. That in itself is so daunting to me, I can't even imagine the workflow involved in trying to manage that kind of archive. But there were pictures that I saw where Ali in Africa, and there's literally 100,000 people surrounding him, but he's turning and he's looking back at Howard. And logistically, as a photographer, I was looking at that and I'm like, how is that possible? Did you just was it a timing thing? Like at 10 minutes from now, turn around and look back at me. No. Howard had this ability to make this noise, this sound that was totally unique. I've never heard this sound made anywhere else in my life. 51 years old, I've never heard this. And he would make that noise and it was loud. And as soon as Ali would hear that noise, he would turn and look towards it. And that's how a lot of those pictures were made. And to be around someone that famous and your responsibility is not only your best friend, but you're a documentarian. You're someone who's there to record this for posterity for everyone because Ali was a global icon. The amount of patience required to do that is incomprehensible to me. I'm a relatively patient guy. My patience increased the more yoga I do. Not to get woo-woo on you, but it's remarkable. So that is my photographer, Howard Bingham. Point number three, word number three, intelligence. Of course, this would be good for a politician. This is very good for a photographer. My photographer, or the photographer that I want to use to represent this, is Magnum photographer Susan Mizelis. And Susan Mizelis, when I was a freshman at UT Austin studying photojournalism, I had no clue what I was doing. Even though I'd already been doing newspaper assignments, I didn't really know what I was doing. Susan Mizelis came and she showed a film called Pictures from a Revolution, which was about her, a documentary film of her in Nicaragua after the war. And it blew my mind. I was like, all I knew after seeing at the end of that film was, I want to be her. I want to do what she's doing. The film showed me a variety of things. It showed me her intelligence level, her knowledge level, her dedication, the danger involved, and the commitment she had for the people of Nicaragua. Now, Susan Mizelis has done a multitude of books and projects over the years. Carnival Strippers, her work in Nicaragua is what made her most known. She also did a huge book on the Kurds. When you look at a Susan Mizelis project, it is not a photo portfolio. It is a far more in-depth, comprehensive, detailed look at a story, a person, a war, a problem, an issue, everything. It's remarkable. So back when I was 1996, I made a portfolio. It was the first digitally printed portfolio I'd ever seen, thanks to my friend Paul Giroux, who had the printer that we banged these things out on. And I was able to afford 10 copies of this thing. And it was basically an oversized laminated magazine. And nobody was doing this at the time. So I took 10 of them and I sent them to all the clients that I thought would never hire me. And I also sent them to people that I really wanted to be, people that I respected. And Susan was on that list. So I send her this thing in the mail unannounced. A couple of months goes by and it comes back to me in the mail with a long handwritten letter from her offering suggestions and encouragement. That was rare. Not many people responded. The director of photography, the National Geographic at the time, Kent Koberstein, he wrote me a handwritten letter saying, holy cow, this portfolio is unlike anything we've ever seen. How did you do it? Blah, blah, blah. That's why I'm still self-publishing today. But Susan took the time to write me back. And 10 years after that, I ran into her in New York and she remembered that. And we had a good conversation. It was at a Blurb event in New York and she came. I don't remember what it was. Anyway, she came. She's remarkable. Just look at the amount of work and knowledge and intelligence that goes into those projects. That is a role model. Okay, point number 4, word number 4. This guy needs no introduction. Tenacity. W. Eugene Smith, considered by many to be the best documentary photographer of all time. I would put him in that category. I think the modern equivalent of him would be Sebastião Salgado. I do not see anyone coming along that will replace or be able to produce what either of these people did. It's simply a matter of fact that the industry will no longer support that kind of work. We don't have that kind of time. We don't have that kind of budgets. Social media is going like this, and the long-term, expensive reportage work is going like this, sadly, because that's the only work that will survive. Gene Smith was a machine. Gene Smith was so completely tenacious and invested in his work that apparently it had an impact on his family. It had an impact on his working relationships. He went above and beyond. And if you look at the things he did, Country Doctor, Minamata, Spanish Civil War, Pittsburgh, etc. And Pittsburgh is the one I want to focus on. So he was hired to do a photo essay for Life magazine on the city of Pittsburgh. And I think they asked him for somewhere between 10 and 20 images. And the rumor is that he delivered 10,000 prints and said, I'm not done. I have more work to do. I should go back. You should keep me on the assignment, etc., etc. That is not common. There's another project he did called the Jazz Lofts Project in New York. There's a book and a movie. Definitely worth seeing. Tearing up, choking up about it. He worked at a level that was bordering on unhealthy. That's the kind of tenacity you have. I got another email this morning from someone saying, I'm 15. I want to start out in photography. I want to be a documentary photographer. What do I do? I'm like, man, you got to shoot every single day. You have to shoot. And don't worry about sharing it. Don't worry about putting it online. Don't worry about printing it yet. Just shoot every single chance you get. And you're going to have to want this more than you can possibly imagine if you're going to make it. Number 5, the word is curiosity. And the photographer is Dan Winters. And I have 4 books behind me right there that are all from Dan Winters. And that is just a portion of the books that he's done. And I'm talking about traditionally published offset official books, and he's done many more. If you took all 4 of those and took the name off and lined them up, they could be done, by the looks of it, it could look like 4 different photographers. There's one on the last shuttle launch. There's one on icons. There's one, I can't even remember what they are. Dan Winters is one of the most amazing photographers working today. But when you spend 5 minutes with Dan Winters, you realize that calling him a photographer is a bit unfair because he is so much more, and this is a word I think is very important. He's interested in so many other things. You can talk about energy, electricity, the space program, aviation, beekeeping, anything. The first time I was able, and I've only hung out with Dan a couple of times, I don't know him that well, hung out with him, and I was like, holy cow, I need to go home and get out the Encyclopedia Britannica and start with A and just try to work my way through Z, because I haven't really started yet. His knowledge level, not to mention unbelievable darkroom printer, unbelievable digital printer, unbelievably technically savvy about anything, shoots motion, shoots stills, shoots celebrities, shoots reportage, constantly making work, constantly tinkering, experimenting. He's a mad scientist. That comes from having a curiosity about the world. I had a conversation with a 19-year-old a couple of years ago. I said, what are you interested in? He goes, nothing. And then the entire time I was around him, he was on Instagram. And I thought, if I was 19 and you gave me Instagram, I'd probably do the same thing. Because once your brain gets hooked on someone else's work and someone else's content, and it's a nonstop barrage, when you turn it off and look at the actual real world, the real world is boring and slow. And it's easier to just go back to the phone. Winters is the personification of what happens if you don't go that way. And I don't know if he's on social or not. I have no idea. I'm sure he is, or part of his studio is, or whatever. I don't care. All I'm saying is that's the kind of curiosity you need. Number 6, positivity. 25% of photographers, maybe 20, maybe 15, they're haters, right? They're going to hate every single thing you do, no matter what it is or how you do it or who it's for and how successful it is. They're going to hate it. And they're probably going to talk smack behind your back. That's just the way it is. Douglas Kirkland is 80 something years old. I met him first when I worked in Kodak, so I probably met him around 1996. He's Canadian, so he's better than us, smarter, happier, friendlier. Douglas Kirkland is one of the most positive people I've ever been around, and he shoots as much as anyone I know, and he's in his 80s. And this guy maybe he's shooting 8x10 black and white, then he's shooting digital. He'll shoot anything, anywhere, anytime. I don't know of anyone who has an archive that is quite like his, that goes back 60 years. He did a lot of the famous Marilyn Monroe. He shoots movie sets with an 8x10. He had an assignment, something like this, and I'm sure I'll get this wrong. He had a monthly assignment from Kodak, so 12 assignments a year, one a month, for something like 40 years straight. I don't even know how to describe him. I went to an exhibition of his in California last year, and you could have made 50 exhibitions from what was just in that one room. It's remarkable. But my point is with Douglas, I've never seen him make a disparaging comment towards anyone else. I've never heard him make a negative comment towards the industry. I've never heard him be discouraging to anyone. I've interviewed him. I've hung out with him several times. I feel fortunate to have been invited into that circle a couple of times in my life. And he literally, when he's talking to you, he's looking at you in the face, and you are the only person in the world who exists when he's talking to you, and he's genuine. And that is so rare in the modern community. We need to clone him. Someone needs to get secretly some DNA. We need some Kirkland DNA, and we need somebody who passed chemistry in high school, which was not me. And we need to figure out how to make another version of him that we need to keep around. Number 7, scale is the word. And the word, the photographer is Sebastião Salgado. Salgado, I worked at Kodak from 96 to 98, 99, something like that. And Salgado was in the midst of one of his big projects. And I remember him, the rumor was he had come to Kodak to ask for something, a lot. Whatever it was big. It was grand. It wasn't like, hey, can I have a brick of film? It was like, can I have all the film you've ever made? That kind of thing. And they gave it to him. But Salgado came with a plan that was unlike anything that anybody had seen, which was a 10-year assessment of what the project would be. Let me repeat that. 10 years, not 10 minutes, not, hey, I just got 50 likes. It was, I'm on a 7-year assignment. I'm going to shoot this for 10 years. This is who's going to publish the book. This is where the exhibitions are going to be. This is how this project is going to end up projected on buildings in Times Square. All this crazy stuff, because they knew he could do it. He had a track record. He'd done this before. If you look at his projects, they're 10-year increments. That to me is the bar. Like, if you're going to do this, that is the bar for what has to be done. And not everybody can do that. I can't work in 10-year increments. I don't have those budgets. I don't have a studio. I don't have a printer, whatever. We all do what we can. But when you're talking about the higher echelons of work, that's where the bar is. And the sad part for me is that I wish I knew an 18-year-old, a 20-year-old girl out there, a 20-year-old woman who is out there that I looked at and said, that's the next Salgado. And hopefully there is someone out there like that. But the industry was different at the time. We live in a different time frame. Our attention spans are not the same. The budgets aren't the same. The timelines are not the same. But when you're looking at scale, Salgado is the person I think is a good representation. Number 8, the word is more, M-O-R-E. I have mentioned this person before, Sarah Terry. She's a photographer, writer. I want to say, has some affiliation now with the 7 agency, but I don't know exactly what that affiliation is. I should have looked it up, but I'm lazy, and I got another meeting here in no time, so I'm on a clock. I mentioned her before. Sarah's a photographer. She does her own work. She's a filmmaker. She's a really good writer. But she also has something called the Aftermath Project. And she's had this for at least a decade. And it's a look at what happens in a conflict zone after the shooting stops. It's all the non-sexy stuff that happens after a war. You know, the parachuters come in and they photograph the action, and they, sometimes win prizes, and then they leave because the story sort of tapers off. The news cycle changes. The public gets bored and they want to move on. And then what happens? So Sarah did a project in Bosnia after the war, and that was her first book. And it focused, I think, quite a bit on Srebrenica, the massacre in Srebrenica, the widows of what happened. And geez, if you don't know that story, it's tragic. And so Sarah is not always thinking about Sarah. And it's easy as a photographer to fall into the scenario where you get up in the morning and your world is right here. The only thing you think about is here because it's really hard. You got to do the business, you got to do the marketing, you got to do the shooting, you got to negotiate, you got to deal with clients, you got to deal with screw ups and transmission or whatever. And your whole time you're right here, right here, right here. And you start to drive everyone around you crazy. I know because I've done it. That's probably why my family's never talked to me about photography, because they probably think, oh God, here he goes again. Sarah doesn't think about herself all the time. She's thinking about you, and she's thinking about me, and she's thinking about all these other projects and things. And she's not the only one. There's a lot of photographers that do this, but I just happen to know her and know that she's been doing this a long time. And I know, based on AG23 and a couple of other things I've done in the past, collaborations, how much work it is to think about other people. It's a lot. And you have to realize that not everybody's going to be helpful, even if you're trying to help them, promote them, choose them, etc. So it's like getting hit in the head from time to time. So that's who I would use to represent more. Number 9, originality. Social media is about what's already been seen and then piggybacking and building following. Original photographers tend not to be on there because they are doing their own thing. And the one that jumps out to me is Joel Peter Witkin. And Witkin apparently lives here in New Mexico. I've never met him. And all I can say is I'm going to keep this one short. There is no one making work like Joel Peter Witkin. I don't even know anyone in the same genre. I don't know what I would call that genre. And I'm not even going to tell you what it is, because you're going to look it up on your own and you're going to say immediately, you're either going to say, wow, this is fascinating, or you're like, I don't want to look at this. Whatever it is, Witkin is original. And that's the key. Originality can be, on one hand, a fallacy. It can be a phantom, a ghost, a phantasma that you're after that can sort of work a number on your head. But I think there is something about originality that is hypercritical. And I think there's a handful of photographers that come around worldwide every generation that bring something new to the table. I was certainly never one of those people. I was derivative. Everything I've ever done is derivative of 1,000 other people. Witkin is doing something unique. Okay, number 10 is risk. Now, there's a lot of photographers that fit this category, taking risks. And I don't mean the two that I'm going to talk about are war photographers, but you don't have to go to war to take a risk. You can just take a creative risk. You can fail and say, oh, that didn't work, and then own it and say, I tried this, it didn't work, I'm moving on, I'm trying this. That's cool. That's what good creatives respect, is fearlessness and risk. Ron Haviv is somebody to look at. He's one of the founders of Seven Agency. Ron has made multiple images in his career that have changed culture, society, politics, war, and history, believe it or not. One guy's made more than one image that's done that. That in itself is remarkable. But the photographer I'm going to focus on is very unknown in America, has been dead for quite some time now. I was fortunate enough to meet her before she died. Her name is Catherine Leroy, Leroy. She's a French photographer. And she won the Kappa Medal for her work, I want to say either in Vietnam or covering the war in Lebanon. She was captured by the NVA and convinced them to allow her to photograph, which made the cover of Life magazine. I think that was the only time that happened, in the middle of the Vietnam War. She got captured. She was tiny. She was this big, and she was a total badass. I was terrified of this woman. She was the first woman, I want to say, first correspondent to do a parachute jump with the military in Vietnam, and they tried to say that she was too small to do it. They had to weigh her down because they thought the parachute would open and it would just fly her off into oblivion. And then they decided they weren't going to let her do it, and she threw an absolute fit, cussed out one of the guys, and they suspended her for 2 weeks. But the troops dug her because she was a badass. She did not ask for preferential treatment. She was fearless. She got wounded, came back, kept going in the field. And I met her through a friend in Los Angeles, Mike Nelson from AFP or EPA, depending on who he was working for at the time. And Mike said, have you ever heard of Catherine Leroy? And I said, oh my God, I've heard about her for years, but I had no idea she was living in LA. Got to meet her, got to spend some time with her. She told me stories about covering the war in Lebanon that just gave me like goosebumps that she survived. That's risk. That's it. And she's a combination. You could put her in any of these categories. She could have the curiosity, the tenacity for sure, intelligence, patience, compassion, etc. But Catherine Leroy is my risk. And number 11 is really bugging me. And the word is location. And when I sent that portfolio to National Geographic in 1996 or 5, I don't remember, Ken Koberstein wrote me that letter. And he said to me, you don't have to travel around the world to do stories. You can shoot in your backyard. So location to me is best represented by another Magnum photographer and one of my all-time favorite people who just, every time I see something he does, it makes me feel like I've never done anything in my life. And that's Trent Park. And Trent Park, I'm going to link a film below. that is him talking about his work. And I stumbled upon this a couple of days ago. It's old, it's a few years old. I just found it. And he talks about shooting in Australia. He's like, look, I'm Australian. This is my country. This is where I shoot. This is all I need. Trent Park works at a level that is terrifying to me. It's simultaneously disheartening when I see him because he's so good, and at the same time, it's incredibly motivating because it's the only thing I've seen in 10 years that made me want to be a photographer again. I just talked to Rick from Beyond, and I told him this. I said, I'm going to send you this link to this film, and it crushed me yesterday. I couldn't stop thinking about it all day because it's just so good. He's so smart, and he's articulate, and he's dedicated, and you see him printing, you see him in the field, you see him processing film, you hear him talking about his work, and then you see this stuff and these prints emerging on the wall and the scale and the exhibitions. And I was like, why did I watch this film? Now I'm going to be haunted by it as I'm sitting inside in the middle of a pandemic. Like, I can't go anywhere, which is fine. I'm going to ride it out. But holy cow. And he shoots in Australia. That's it. That's all he needs. And his work is mind-blowingly good. He, to me, is representative of location. So that is my take. That's my 11 names. I will link them. My internet is so slow here. It's agonizing. When I say I'm going to link these, do you know what that means? Do you know how much time that's going to take for me to link these in this film? It's just agonizing. It's horrible. But I'm going to do it because I care and because I'm a swell guy. So I hope that's helpful. These are all people that really influenced me. They continue to influence me. I'm in awe of a lot of what these people have done. I have certainly never done anything remotely in the category of any of these people, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for who they are and what they do. I hope that's helpful to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch.